and good afternoon. Welcome to another Vice News live stream. As always, I'm your host, Lee Adams, and this week I'm joined again by Danielle Cadet, who is the managing editor of Unbothered at Refinery 29. Danielle, what's up? Welcome back.
Hey Lee, it's good to be back. I'm excited for another really timely and really important conversation.
As am I. And today, as you know, we'll be discussing Juneteenth. It's the holiday that is commemorating the end of slavery when Northern soldiers rode into Texas. But the common misconception is that it actually marks the end of the emancipation, which happened 2 years prior to June 19th, or the holiday known as Juneteenth. And I can say I am one of the Americans that did not know about that. Being someone who was raised in Northern Virginia, this was not something I was taught really at any point throughout my primary education. And I didn't know about Juneteenth until college, really. I'm not sure about you, Danielle, but what was your experience with learning about the holiday?
No, absolutely. I can totally relate. I grew up in Long Island in New York, and I don't think this was something and I think this is a lot of things that a lot of Black Americans and Americans in general can relate to is, this wasn't a major chapter in our history books, unfortunately, like so many things that are left out of our history books, quite frankly. And it is important to acknowledge that Juneteenth is certainly a holiday that has roots in Texas, and largely because of the Great Migration that, that has spread throughout the country, and obviously has taken on, a much huger national significance, of course. But yeah, I think it's worth noting that this isn't a thing that we learned about in school. This isn't, a thing that we talked about. I think, and so much of that really is at odds with the tension and the difficulty that a lot of Black Americans have around Independence Day, around the 4th of July. There is not we were not necessarily taught about Juneteenth the same way we were taught about the 4th of July, and to really acknowledge this celebration of Black liberation, of Black joy. It was certainly sort of skirted over for me in my elementary school years. And I agree, it wasn't something that I really learned about in depth until college. And I think we're now in this moment, in this reckoning, where we are asking ourselves, we're revisiting this idea of Black liberation. And to your point, even when I do the math of when I feel slavery ended, I say 1865, even though the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in January of 1863. So it is, for us to talk about that disconnect of Black enslaved people being free, but not really being free, and the irony of where we are today, as Black people, being free and not really being liberated. And so I think that connects to where we are right now and this moment that we're in right now. And quite frankly, why Juneteenth this year feels so different than it ever has.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. And in following with the ideas of liberation and freedom, it is Pride Month, and we will be having a great discussion later in the hour with Ianne Fields Stewart, who is an actor and an activist in the Black trans movement sphere. And in this moment, we're actually going to be joined by Dr. Salamishah Tillet, who is a professor of African American Studies at Rutgers University, so that we can better understand why we aren't more aware of Juneteenth as a holiday in this country. Salamishah, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. I'd really love to hear from you. Why is it that we are not more widely taught about Juneteenth in America?
Well, I think you both spoke to some of the reasons why it takes all of us, or at least a large group of us, to learn about Juneteenth in college, unless you grew up with it yourself, right? So, I think the biggest problem is that we don't really talk about the history of and legacy of slavery in America. So if you refuse to talk about one of our founding sins, right, the way in which America kind of built itself as like a superpower and an empire, if you forget or erase or refuse to remember that history, then you're also going to refuse to remember the ways in which Black people tried to celebrate their freedom and also celebrate their own sense of community and self-definition. So it's not surprising in a country that really hasn't yet grappled with its founding sin of slavery, that we still are suddenly learning about. Most people seem like they just heard of Juneteenth for the first time, like over the last 2 weeks, really, which is pretty astonishing. I know that we're saying we learned about it in college, but now it seems as if it hasn't been celebrated for, over 100 years, which is pretty interesting to watch.
Absolutely. And you make such an important point there, in terms of this idea of dealing with our original sin. Lee, I know you mentioned this as we prepared for this conversation. The way that we talk about Independence Day, in that there is, the enemy is very much the British, right? Like we can look over there and say that our freedom and liberation was held back because of this common enemy. But that's really complicated with the sin of slavery in this country, in that, the enemy, so to speak, is within our own confines, is within our own country. And I think that's always been there's always been a really complicated feeling and tension around that, especially for white Americans.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember that the Declaration of Independence and these celebrations of American freedom literally came out of a kind of a devil's pact, right, with the slaveholders and the slaveholding states, right? So that African Americans weren't even counted as fully human. This is the thing that we call like the 3/5 compromise, right? So slaveholding states would be able to count those who were enslaved in terms of, funds received from the government, for example. But at the same time, those people weren't considered human and they didn't have the right to vote. So it's a really terrible pact that American freedom was born on. It was born literally on the backs of enslaved people. And so to separate those two things is not only frightening and horrible to do, but also it creates this long-standing amnesia around slavery, that we can celebrate freedom and we refuse to remember the way in which it was tied up and dependent on slavery itself.
And not only that, but the holiday in and of itself is an acknowledgement of the fact that slavery ended on one date, but that didn't make it illegal immediately. And it was a process of it kind of being scaled back in the rest of the country over the coming years, and then replaced with different institutions that were essentially the exact same process.
Yeah, I mean, I think Juneteenth was bittersweet when it was created, and it's bittersweet now, right? So you spoke to the fact that not only did enslaved people in Texas find out that they were free 2.5 years after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st of 1863, and 2 months after Robert Lee surrendered, right? So you have two different time lags. You have all enslaved people were free in 1863, and then in 1865 in April, the Confederates surrendered. And still, it took another 2 months until individuals and institutions and people in Texas were able to be free. So I think that's like the way in which Black freedom struggles and Black demands for freedom are always kind of delayed. And Juneteenth, I think, represents both the delaying of Black freedom on one hand, and the ways in which Black people will take something as devastating as a delayed freedom and turn it into a form of resistance and celebration and community, right? So Juneteenth is both a mark of the ways in which freedom is denied to Black people, and it's a recognition of the ways in which Black people can really truly manifest the best of America, despite the fact that America really hasn't always recognized us as human or given us our full freedom.
I find that incredibly interesting. I'm sorry, Lee. I find that incredibly interesting, just because we talked about this a little bit too, about sort of the complicated nature of of sort of teetering this line between Black joy and Black liberation, but also, again, to your point, of this sort of delayed liberation, this idea that it has taken so much time for Black Americans to actually be seen as human in this country. I talked a little bit about the treasonous nature of the Civil War, of the fact that, there's a lot of times when Southerners are referring to the Confederate flag, they're saying heritage, not hate, but that's very much a heritage that's steeped in treason, in this idea of sort of overthrowing the government. And so I do think that Juneteenth in and of itself then ends up being very complicated, in that there's an aspect of celebration, there's an aspect of Black joy there. And to your very salient point, I think it's a huge part of Black American history in being able to create life and to find joy against all odds.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess I would also like to acknowledge the ways in which Black people post-slavery continue to create celebrations and holidays that celebrated their freedom, but that kind of get written out of the big history, right? So Memorial Day is another holiday that really actually came out of Black communities that were celebrating Black soldiers who fought on behalf of Black liberation. And so that's where Memorial Day comes from. And yet, when we celebrated a couple of weeks ago, we barely remember that history, right? And so Juneteenth is another holiday that's local. It's not national the way Memorial Day is. Memorial Day is a national holiday that forgets Black people's founding of it. Juneteenth is a more local or regional holiday that speaks to the ways in which the slavery has been written out of the national story. There are other holidays too, not holidays, but celebrations that I think are important just to mention in this context. And that's the Watch Night, right? So formerly enslaved people on the birth, right, on December 31st of 1862, knowing that Lincoln was about to issue his Emancipation Proclamation, gathered and celebrated their coming freedom. And so before Juneteenth took place, there were African-American communities around the country, and still I have a good friend today who was telling me that's what she grew up celebrating, that that there are ways in which Black people have always been trying to celebrate their freedom. And while we're acknowledging Juneteenth, I just want to recognize that there are these other traditions that we can also consider acknowledging and recognizing and perhaps nationalizing as well.
And I'd love to kind of present a question to both of you. Danielle, I'd love to hear your perspective on how does this fit into the national conversations happening right now around justice or the lack thereof, or equality or the lack thereof. And when we think about names like Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, how does this celebration of freedom fit into those conversations?
100%. I think Salamishah touched on it so in such an incredible way, is that we're really talking about a delay here, right? We're talking about rights that have been given, so to speak, to Black people that Black Americans are still very much waiting on. We're kind of waiting for that. The check has been written, but it hasn't been cashed. And so I think that is part of the reason why Juneteenth feels so incredibly appropriate and incredibly impactful this year and in this moment. Not to say that it hasn't been in the past, because obviously it has been, but there's something about what's happening right now, this reckoning, so to speak, that's taking place right now, and this moment where Black people are demanding justice in the here and now, and are saying, we're not waiting for a delay anymore. We're not going to, you can't sign a proclamation in 1863 and make us wait 2.5 years. We've waited long enough. And so I think that's very much where we are right now. I think we are absolutely seeing that moment. And at the same time, we are seeing these incredible moments of joy. We are seeing music being played at protests. We are seeing beautiful art come out of this movement. We are seeing, as we often do as Black people, us finding joy where there oftentimes seems like there is none. And so, again, it is very much our history as Black people in this country is to somehow find a balance between, abject sorrow and anger and rage, and at times feeling very disappointed, but also finding incredible beauty in who we are as people in this country. And I think, to Salamishah's point is, I think Black Americans have always really shown the true ideals of America. And we're at a point right now where, as a culture, we are demanding that America keeps its promises.
And I guess I would add to that too.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, like, when a year after, when enslaved people in Texas found out that they were free, and they started creating and celebrating their freedom on June 19th in 1866. What's interesting, or what's different about this moment than that moment, I mean, they were still confronting former slaveholders who did not want them to be free. They were on the precipice of legal segregation. And so their freedom was not just deferred, but their freedom was deeply contained by white supremacy. And what you see now, and there's a risk, of course, of a hyper commercialization of Juneteenth, which we never really had before until this moment, but there's always that risk. So we have to pay attention to that, the way in which everyone's celebrating it, and does it in some ways take away from the political importance and historical significance of it. But a more optimistic point of view could be that what we're seeing now with the diverse crowds that are coming out and in support of and chanting Black Lives Matter. I mean, in cities like New York and Los Angeles, it's predominantly white people who are taking on the Black freedom struggle for the first time in American history outside of the Civil War itself. And I would say that even during the Civil War, you did not have people necessarily fighting to end slavery because they thought Black people were equal. But here you have a shift in the movement, or maybe a temporary shift, but I'm optimistic that maybe there are long-term shifts in consciousness, and white people are really dealing with what it means to be white, and and whiteness's relationship to power and privilege and racism and white supremacy. And that's a very difficult identity to unpack and to own and understand how your identity has been predicated on the oppression of people, the way American democracy has been predicated on American slavery. But at the same time, I feel like, well, this nationalizing of Juneteenth without it becoming a national holiday is really interesting. It's a taking on of the history of slavery as if it's your own. And I think there's something that could come out of that for all of us for the future. And I have a 8-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I hope that their future and their tomorrow is better than mine was, and definitely better than those who were enslaved.
Danielle, I'm curious to hear from you where you find the call to action here, right? What do we do moving forward? I think, you mentioned these ideas of Black joy, and I really love sort of the way that we've dissected those kind of understandings. But in Juneteenth, not only being a celebration and an acknowledgement of our past, but also a call to action for reshaping our future, where do you think we go from here, and extending liberation to, not only just Black people in general, but to our neighbors in the LGBTQ plus community?
Absolutely. I think one place we start is sort of where we started this conversation, right? It's education. It's the fact that, all of us said we didn't learn about Juneteenth until college, and so, to Salamishah's point, that my hope is that your 8 and your 4-year-old have a very different, experience, and have very different textbooks than any of us had, and don't necessarily have to wait to get to college to have that education and to learn that. But in that framework, again, this is really about including and telling the full American story. And in that, to that end, I think we have to think about that with respect to not only Pride Month, but with respect to, our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters, in that we cannot tell parts of the story. And I think that's part of the challenge that we've had in not only in this country, but in our society as a whole, is that we very much pick and choose which parts of the story we want to tell, and whose parts of the story we want to elevate. And that is, quite frankly, unacceptable. We are largely seeing, particularly in the Black Lives Matter movement, the push for all Black lives. And it's incredibly important that we tell the full story of who we are as Black people. And that includes our LGBTQIA brothers and sisters. And so I think what we're learning from Juneteenth is it cannot be an excuse for us to know part of the history. It cannot be an excuse for us to know some people's stories and not others. That it's not okay for us to talk about Independence Day for America, but to not talk about Independence Day for Black Americans. And in the same realm, it's not okay for us to talk about Black lives and to focus only on Black men or cis Black women. That's unacceptable. And so I think where we go from here is we challenge ourselves to fight for everyone's story and to fight for everyone's rights and to tell the full story to our children moving forward.
Salamishah, in looking back in history, when we have had these moments of acknowledgement and the struggle for civil rights, have we always also carried along our loved ones in the LGBTQ plus community as Black Americans?
I mean, no. I mean, I guess that would be the most obvious answer. I think most famously, we could look at the civil rights movement and the ways in which figures like Bayard Rustin or Lorraine Hansberry, Nina Simone, James Baldwin, as they were fighting on behalf of Black people and to defeat segregation, that their sexual identity and their queerness had to be sidelined in advance of a freedom struggle. And what I find really compelling about this moment is that as we talked about before, like Black freedom struggles have always pushed American democracy forward, right? But then if we have a Black freedom struggle that is limited and that isn't acknowledging the diversity, the complexity, and the fluidity of what Blackness means, then it's a limited freedom struggle. It's a limited freedom struggle that affects all Americans and that really hurts Black people in particular. So I really have been really charged and really excited by the fact that what we're having are almost two conversations, and I hope we can, not us, but in the general culture, there's a conversation Black people are having with white people, like Black Lives Matter, and there's a conversation Black people are having with Black people, all Black Lives Matter. And really what we need to be saying is all Black lives matter to white people. And so that they are then pushing forward a narrative of Black life that doesn't devalue Black trans folk, Black trans men and women, and Black women, cis, trans, or gender nonconforming. Because there are lots of different ways in which we're invisibilizing those who are literally dying around us at this very moment, and valuing some Black deaths over other Black deaths. And I think that moment it needs to go away, because we're not going to really be free unless we're all free. And so I just find it so interesting that we're having these conversations about Juneteenth, and we're also celebrating Pride. And here we're trying to bring them together. And I think that if we could really put Black trans women in particular at the forefront of how we imagine liberation, then all Black people really will be free.
Salamishah, that was so eloquent and so well put. And I know it's something that I need to do more of in thinking about my friends, neighbors, and loved ones who are members of the LGBTQ community, and remembering to champion their experiences and the fact that their lives also matter while we all advocate for freedom for all of us. And I think this is a great moment to bring in our next guest, Ianne Fields Stewart, who is an actor and an activist. Ianne, welcome to the live stream. Thank you for being here. Ianne, how do you feel about this moment, this reckoning, as it's been called, in fighting for liberation within the Black community, while also being an activist and being a member of our LGBTQ plus community?
It feels like it's about time. It feels like, I mean, as y'all kind of were talking about, if we understand the true history of the Black freedom struggle, we understand that Black, queer, and trans people have been at the center, forefront, sidelines, behind, at every corner of the movement from the beginning. It's just that we as a collective have not always had the language to name and claim those people within our movements.
And Danielle, what do you think we should do more of when we think about intersectionality in this moment? How can we push the agenda forward for all of us and not just, some of us?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, first of all, again, it comes down to educating ourselves. We have to acknowledge, one of the most infuriating things about this moment, and to Salamishah's point, and Salamishah, thank you so much for joining us. To Salamishah's point is, there are a lot of people that it is a little infuriating when you hear people just learning about something, right? When you hear people like saying, "Oh, I never even knew Juneteenth exists. Oh, I never knew Bayard Rustin was queer." Excuse me. I think the first part is for us to address that this didn't just start happening yesterday. People didn't just start being queer. Queer people weren't part of this movement all of a sudden yesterday. This is something that's been happening, and it's offensive to ignore that history. And so that's the first thing I think we need to do, is to really acknowledge the fact that, the LGBTQ plus folks in this movement have been at the forefront since the beginning. And so we shouldn't act like this is something that's all of a sudden been born recently, because I find that, and in the same way that we would find that offensive for anybody, and for ourselves as Black people, I think we need to do that. I think that we have to, in the same way that we're asking, we have to check our own privilege. We have to really make room and put all people at the forefront of this movement and acknowledge them as such. I think we saw such a powerful, incredible protest in Brooklyn this past weekend. And one of the things that Raquel Willis said was, if you don't have a Black trans woman in a leadership position in your company or in your place of business, then you don't have a leg to stand on. You don't have a place here. And so we have to, acknowledge that. And, when we talk about diversity, when we talk about wanting to have diverse voices, we have to acknowledge all of those voices. I think, we in the Black community we have to have our own reckoning. Again, Salamishah mentioned this, is that we are saying to white people, Black Lives Matter. We are also saying to ourselves as a Black community, all Black lives matter. And so, I think we're having a little bit of our own reckoning right now, in that we can't, again, we can't let history be patriarchal in the way that we have. We can't just, our history can't be made of Black men in blue suits, and I'm not talking about police officers. I'm talking about like Martin Luther King, and these respectability politics that we have created and that we've adhered to for so long. That's not what our history is made of. We need to be more pervasive and really understand who's truly, fully part of this movement.
And if I may, I'd also like to expand a little bit of that in understanding that, when we talk about education, I want to be clear that valuing Black trans lives and valuing Black queer lives is not just about understanding what those lives have done for the community, because I think that there is a danger there in assuming that Black life is only valuable if it has contributed something to the larger Black movement, and I think that can be a very dangerous politic. And what we need to actually, the reckoning that needs to occur, is the fact that for so long we have had language for how to abuse queer and trans people, but never language for how to support queer and trans people. We have acted as if, we don't see the music director in the church. We have acted as if we don't know what's up with the makeup artist, or we have acted as if we don't understand why uncle, so-and-so and so-and-so, or auntie so-and-so and so-and-so have their special roommate. We have had language for how to hide and abuse and manipulate queer and trans people for much longer than we care to admit. And the reckoning that has to occur is that we don't necessarily need an education. We need to look at ourselves. We need to look at, we don't need to teach ourselves that Black life matters, right? We don't need to teach ourselves that that human beings matter, that's a terrible debate to have. Just as you were saying, it's a terrible debate to be a part of. And so many people ask me, oh well, why does trans representation matter? Why does why do Black trans lives matter? And it is insulting and it is infuriating to kind of have to be part of conversations where I'm advocating for why I, as a human being, should be considered valuable. It doesn't have to be about what I proved. It doesn't have to be about what we've done in history. Our present, right now, all of our communities are populated with Black, trans, and queer people, and each and every one of us is valuable, whether we went to college, whether we didn't go to college, whether we are sex workers, whether we are entrepreneurs and business owners, whether we are activists on the street, or whether we're just people who are living our lives, and I think that's part of the necessary conversation. I kind of wanted to expand a little bit on that because I think that it's important that we recognize that education goes beyond just what we've done in the past. It also reflects what we're doing right now and what we will do in the future.
Exactly. And Ianne, on that same note, in kind of taking this a step further, understanding that while it is great to see so much Black trans visibility and we need more during Pride Month, that also needs to extend well beyond Pride Month.
Absolutely.
Talk to me a little bit about that as well, making sure that we are not only acknowledging these lives for 1 month out of the summer.
I think that, just as we cannot ask white people to undo racism, or just as we cannot ask Black people to undo racism because white people created it, we cannot ask trans people to undo transphobia because we did not create it. That is the job of cis people. And so I think that something kind of a recent rallying cry of mine has been, stop asking me, ask yourself, because at the end of the day, there's only so much that I can tell you. I can say, oh, well, read, Janet Mock's Redefining Realness and Surpassing Certainty, or read, read this particular text or watch this particular show, and you'll get an idea of it. But at the end of the day, the best person who knows how to undo transphobia in your world and in your life is you. And so you have to be the one to take responsibility for that. As far as what I hope for our future and what I hope for what will be coming in the years, months, time to come, whatever quarantine decides, what I find hopeful and valuable is that is that Black trans people will just be able to walk down a street and experience no fear, no belief that our lives are constantly in danger. I want to go to protests and not have to go to protests that singularly center Black trans people, because I'm afraid that if I go to another kind of protest, I don't know who all is around me, and I don't know if they'll come to my rescue if I need it. Because if I'm put in a prison, I'm not going to go to there are no right prisons, but I'm not going to go to the right jail. I'm going to go to a jail with a very different experience and a very different crowd of people, and will be treated in a certain way. And so I think that recognizing that our work and our lives need to be filled and populated. We need to bring Uncle so-and-so and Auntie so-and-so out of the shadows and say, stop calling them your roommate. There's no more roommates, no more hashtags, no more roommates, no more of that, because we don't need to, in 2020, have people having roommates that have been there for 40 years. You too grown, and we too grown for that.
Danielle, I'd love to ask you, because in a lot of these moments of change, we have seen this happening, whether it was the women's movement that originally was suffrage for white women, not Black women, because, one battle at a time, or the civil rights movement, as we've learned, was kind of centered around cisgendered identities. How, in your mind, can we better sort of be inclusive in this moment and push for justice and the extension of liberty and liberation for all people?
I have to acknowledge how much life Ianne has given me right now. Like, honestly, the roommate, like, it's yes, that's everything. I just want to everything that was just said. But I think one of the things we have to do is we have to listen. I think we so often try to control narratives, and we try to hand over power or allow people to keep power. This is moment requires a complete relearning. I mean, to Ianne's point, we have learned for a really long time as a community to, think of code words or to think of things that make people comfortable, or, to really be very okay with hiding things, sort of in the same way that, we don't talk about problematic uncles who may or may not, or aunties who may or may not have, touched folks inappropriately. We as a community are very comfortable with hiding things and with just kind of ignoring things. And so I think we have to get better at that. We have to push ourselves. We have to make ourselves uncomfortable in the same way that we're asking white people to be uncomfortable. I think, I've heard a lot of people in this moment ask themselves, like, what side of history do you want to be on when we look back at this moment and we're talking to our grandchildren or, the future, and we're recalling these stories. Where do you want to say that you stood? And, when we look back in history and we look back on history books, I often, ask myself, like, what would some of our historical icons say if we ask them about leaving, queer and trans folks out of this narrative, about leaving, women out of this narrative? What would they say? And so I think we've got to ask ourselves, what am I going to say about where I stood and what I did, and how do I make myself proud of myself in this moment, and so that I can be proud of myself later. I don't think that I certainly personally don't want to look back at myself and say that, I wasn't acknowledging my own privilege, or that I wasn't making space for this movement in its entirety. So I think that's one of the things that we have to challenge ourselves to do, because to your point, Lee, this is, history kind of repeats itself in this way where we do incremental things. We're like, okay, let's give these people rights first, and then we'll get to these people, and then but that's not going to work this time. And in the same way that we said about Juneteenth, is it's like, we don't have time. We don't have time to wait 2.5 years after a proclamation is signed. We don't have time to, give people incremental rights. We don't have time to look at a community and say, okay, y'all get it first, and then y'all. That's not going to work, So we need to do this holistically right now in this moment.
Ianne, I'd love to also get your take, because in thinking about this sort of self reflection that we all kind of must navigate our way through, I can say as a Black man, I've enjoyed the privilege of not knowing much about the Stonewall demonstrations, not knowing much or lending my voice or perspective to, or using my privilege for the advancement of Black trans or Black queer rights or equality. How much acknowledgement of what we don't know does the Black community really need to do in order to make sure that we're not leaving our own loved ones behind?
That is such an interesting question. And I think I'm going to, if I may, create a model in this moment for folks, which is that I'm going to direct it right back to you as a Black man and ask you, what, you are you aware of Nina Pop? Are you aware of Malaysia Booker? Are you aware of Diamond Stevens? Do these names feel familiar to you and their stories?
Not at all.
So all three of these women are Black trans women who have been murdered. And I want to know from you, kind of, what do you need for those lives to be important enough to shift your world focus?
To be honest, I don't think I need anything as much as I need to acknowledge the fact that I need to do the work to make sure that those names are names that are readily available to me, that I can recall their stories and their importance at any given moment.
Amazing. And what tools do you need to make that happen for yourself?
I think I just need that information. I need to seek out that information, right? I need to read better books and different books and have conversations with different folks and expose myself to different media that allows me to, have this information available to me, to know these names, and then also champion them and what they contributed. And as you put it, not only that, but just championing the personhood of my own neighbors.
Amazing. Can I ask another question of you? Do you identify as
Please.
heterosexual?
I do.
So when you talk about dating women, who are you referring to?
I think typically, if you had asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have said women who were born female with a female biology. But knowing what I know now and evaluating my own sort of misconceptions about what that is and what that means and how hurtful and othering even that perspective can be, understanding that trans women are women. And when I am saying that I'm a heterosexual man, that means that I am open and available to the idea of dating people who identify who preferred pronouns are either they or she hers.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty powerful stuff. And that also means, doesn't it, in that, right, that then you have to do the kind of groundbreaking, world-shifting work of understanding that what's between a woman's legs is not relevant to your attraction to her. And
Right.
isn't that like some powerful work that, yeah. So look, it's like this, and so I think that this model that you're providing right now, and I like celebrate that you're providing it. This is what needs to be happening. Is that the lens needs to shift. We need to start having more cis Black heterosexual men who are willing to, on camera in public, make mistakes, and also who are willing to name their own blind spots and say, here's what I need to do. Because the thing is that I would love to come on this. This is a lovely program. This is a lovely show. I would love to come on this show and talk to y'all about any old thing. I don't want to come and talk to you about trans stuff because not that there's anything wrong with talking about trans stuff, because it's beautiful and important work, and my community is amazing, and I love us down, and I love talking about us. But at the end of the day, there is so much going on up here. And because the world is just kind of coming into an understanding of what, all of this beauty is, and they're just like kind of just getting into my tea and getting into all of what makes me so fine and so delicious, they're missing so much of what's going on up here, because I've got a lot of things to say, and they're pretty interesting. And not all of them are about being trans. All of them are filtered through the lens of my being trans, but they're also filtered through the lens of my being a Black woman. And being a Black woman who is from the Deep South, and being a Black woman who has had the privilege to occupy space in a predominantly white institution, and to move my way out of that space and to recover from that space. There's so many things. Like, I'm an actress. I got a lot of things to talk about, and being trans is all just a little part of that. So I think I thank you for being willing to create that model for folks. And I hope that anyone who is watching will start to have those same conversations with themselves, because at the end of the day, I can tell you day in and day out, the names, I can tell you why they're there. But at the end of the day, Google is right there, and she is so much more wise than I.
And I'm speechless by this moment right now, but I want to touch on something that is really important right now, and something that you said as far as making mistakes. I think this is, Lee, that's a really difficult thing for you to do right now in a live stream, with however many people watching, and I think that oftentimes when we're doing this work in general of unlearning and educating ourselves, we are so scared to make mistakes, and I've had so many conversations with white folks about like, well, what if I say it wrong? And what if I don't do the right thing? Or I don't know what to do. And, I think it was so powerful what you just pointed out about the fact that mistakes are going to be made, but that doesn't mean that learning can't happen.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think that also something about this is the recognition that, like, the work of sort of like walking someone through an education, it is a labor in and of itself. However, this is something I do for y'all, because we like this.
Right.
This is not something I do for white folks, so white folks have Google, they can figure that out. They've had that resource for a very long time. All of their friends and aunties and uncles made it. So, but I think that this for me is the work that I am dedicating myself to do. Like, when I do it, I only do it with Black people. And I think that is the thing that we can now start to move into, is the understanding that, like, if we gonna ask the labor of like Black trans people, we gonna ask them to do the kind of the labor with us, ask your people. Ask people that look like you, because I think that what I've seen time and time again, and something that I find incredibly frustrating, is that so often there are these incredible Black leaders who are doing incredible work in the struggle for freedom and the struggle for liberation. And because of their own blind spots as cis heteronormative people, when it comes to talking about the LGBTQIA LMNOP community that I belong to and love dearly, that, so often they shift their gaze to center and focus on white folks. And it perpetuates a dangerous narrative that queerness is somehow singularly linked to whiteness. And I need to be very clear that queerness and Blackness is an indigenous link that has been around throughout all of our deities, all of our ancestral and indigenous practices. Once again, just because we are now coming into language for how to name and claim all of our people does not mean that all of us have not been here from the beginning.
That's such a powerful sentiment. Ianne, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and for being here and donating your time to our live stream. You've been so generous, and I've really enjoyed it. Danielle, anything else from you?
I'm blown away. Blown away, truly. This is the only word that I could come up with.
Thank you both
Ianne,
so much.
I can tell you we will have, and I guarantee you we will have you back, so no worries on that.
Amazing. All right, let's see what's up here.
Let's talk about acting. Let's talk about all of it.
Let's talk about all of it, darling. Honey, we can get into the makeup of it all, the fancy of it all. We can really do some things. All right. Thank you so much for having me, you too.
Thank you for being here. Danielle, I love this idea and continuing this idea of self-reflection and introspection, not only for America, but for Black people specifically. What are your thoughts in kind of pushing that conversation forward? And what are the actionable steps, to ask, when we leave this live stream for our viewers to think about how can we make sure we are being inclusive in this moment? Because Black Lives Matter means all Black lives, not just the model ones that we see on TV or those whose lives we've seen, extinguished on a camera phone.
Absolutely. I think Ianne really kind of creating that model in real time is something that I personally am going to sit with, really asking yourself these questions, right? Because we so often have this expectation of the, individuals that are part of that community to answer those questions for us, right? Rather than doing the work ourselves. And, so I so often think like in order for me to do the work or to change my frame of mind, I have to have a conversation with a trans person. I need to ask, what do you want me to do? Right. But the question really has to be put inward of like, well, what do you need in order to change? And I think to a certain extent, and you demonstrated this, was like, I don't really need much to respect somebody's life. I don't need much to acknowledge someone's humanity. That's not a thing that I need. I don't need that. But what do I need to do? How do I need to educate myself? How do we make sure that those names are just as pervasive and just as well known as a George Floyd or an Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor? How do we make sure that that's done? What work can I do as a member of the media to make sure I use my own platform for that to happen? I think Ianne just gave us a really great model of how do we put that onus on ourselves? How do we do the work ourselves as people as people who are in a privileged position, as people who aren't part of certain communities? I think that she not only gave us the model, of how to have this conversation about the LGBTQ community, but how to have this conversation about race in general. I hope that even from a perspective of talking about race, that we could kind of recreate that and say, okay, well, what do you need? What do you need to know these names? What do you need, how do you see me as a Black woman, and what do you need in order to see me holistically and as a human? So I really think that we did some work even in this moment. And I think that's part of what we take from here. That's part of how we move forward.
Yeah, I can say even on my end, remembering sort of how difficult it was for me the first time I was like put in my place and someone had to check me because of how I was enjoying my privilege as a straight male, however many years ago that was, to having a wider circle of people who do have different walks of life and different experiences within the Black community, acknowledging the unique challenges to being a Black woman or to being a member of the Black queer community or the Black trans community. And then also, again, like I said, when I was in my early 20s, understanding that what is in between a woman's legs is not the determining factor of her womanhood, right? And so I think for me, there is still, and there is a lot more learning for me to just do in this moment to make sure that I'm carrying the torch, not only for myself and my children, but also for my neighbors who are members of the LGBTQ plus community, as we all strive to make a more perfect union and extend liberty to all Black lives and not just some Black lives, right? All lives, period, and not just some lives. And I really want to thank all of our guests for being here and having such an incredible conversation and giving us so much to think about. Danielle, I want to thank you for being here and bringing, your just incredible intellect to these conversations, as you always do. I'm always so excited to sit down here with you.
Same. I mean, Lee, I always enjoy our conversations. I feel like I've learned something today. I do think it's just to go full circle in terms of our conversation about Juneteenth. This is celebratory, this learning, this moment, this is something to be proud of. The fact that we have gotten to this point as Black people, we are our ancestors' wildest dreams. Our ancestors are joyous and are celebrating the fact that we are here. Do we have a long way to go? Absolutely. But even just having these conversations and knowing that we're doing the work, for me personally, gives me something to celebrate tomorrow. Tomorrow it's a joyous day. I think we need to think about it the same way we think about 4th of July. It's like we have made it past a really major injustice. And we need to, again, make sure that America makes good on those promises and that we hold her accountable. But we should celebrate. We should celebrate this moment. We should celebrate the fact that we're not willing to wait, 2.5 years post-proclamation. We've got to have our liberation now.
Right. And I think what's interesting is I'm finally understanding the discomfort that comes along with admitting what you don't know and seeing your own privilege play out in front of you in real time. I understand why some of our white neighbors may be so uncomfortable with having to admit, like, damn, I really have been privileged this whole time, and now I have to admit it, and now I have to unlearn things and relearn things. Like, it's uncomfortable to find out you have been a part of the problem and know that you need to do better. But there is a tremendous air of inspiration that comes along with knowing I'm ready to do the work, and I'm excited to do the work because it's important and it deserves to be done. And I need to do what I can to do it. So with that, I want to thank everyone for tuning in and being here with us. Danielle, any closing thoughts from you?
I think to your point, we all have privilege, right? We all are part of the problem in some way. And again, the question is, when do you ask yourself, like, when do you become aware of that and make the choice to either still be part of the problem or change your behavior? Whether we have privilege as a result of gender or class or disability, right? Being able to walk is a privilege. When do you acknowledge what your privileges are, and when do you decide to ignore them? Because if you're deciding to ignore them, you're making a choice. You are making a choice to perpetuate the problem. And so I think we can acknowledge that we are at least making a choice to challenge those privileges, and that is a marathon and not a race. It's not a thing that will happen in a matter of days or seconds or weeks. It is a thing that requires constant work every single day in order for us to really, be proud of the society that we're part of. And so you know, I think we've each got to acknowledge that that's work. To your point about like being a cis male, I could say the same thing about being a cis woman, you know, and acknowledging that whether it's what's between a woman's legs or what's between a man's legs, like that has nothing to do with what makes that person a man or a woman. And so I think we all have to acknowledge whatever our privilege is, and acknowledge that we might have multiple privileges, and that we have to unpack all of those. And so I think this conversation, and I'm proud to be a part of this conversation, in that I do feel like we very genuinely address that in a way that makes me feel really, really good about the work that we're doing.
And with that, I want to thank everyone for tuning in to another live stream. I'm Lee Adams, as always, joined by Danielle Cadet, and I'm sure we'll see you soon. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.
Bye.